Years on from the violent disturbances on the streets of London, which shocked the nation, Sue McGregor brings together those involved on both sides of the barricades during the Brixton riots of 1981.
"30 years ago, over an April weekend, Brixton in South London exploded into violence. For almost 3 days, hundreds of young men, many though not all of them black, fought the Metropolitan Police, attacking buildings, looting shops and setting fire to cars. Pavements were dug up to provide an almost constant supply of missiles. It was to be the most serious and damaging civil unrest in London in the 20th century. By the time it was over, almost 300 policemen and 65 members of the public had been injured. Riots were to follow later in other parts of Britain, including Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester. Brixton was a poor area of London, suffering high unemployment. Lord Scarman's report on the events of that April weekend would lead to major changes in policing, not least in the way it affected the black community. Although it took many people by surprise, below the surface, anger towards the police and the political establishment as a whole had been brewing for years.
Some had enthused about the pleasure the carnival gave. Now they reflected on how they were ill-equipped to deal with the violence when it broke out.
In 1976, antagonism between the black population and the police in the Notting Hill area of London led to clashes at that year's carnival.
Hundreds of angry youths have been fighting police since early this afternoon when police tried to carry out a raid on a drinking spot.
And in 1980, policing methods in the mainly black St Paul's district of Bristol infuriated the residents.
They come in there, right? I didn't know, right? They come in and grab me up, right? Shot me in the corner, right?
Brixton had been a cause for concern for many years. It was regarded as one of the most deprived corners of the capital. Devon Thomas, who was then Employment Promotions Officer with Lambeth Council, had seen what this meant for the High Street.
John Lewis Partnership, they had closed. C&A, British Home Stores, had, as the recession had hit, moved out.
We were elected to reduce taxes, not to increase.
Things were made worse by cuts to local authority spending, announced by the Conservative Environment Secretary Michael Heseltine.
There will be no more cash.
I mean, these guys were sort of sloshing money around as though there was no tomorrow. That did nothing to avoid the riots. They were just not using it effectively or intelligently.
Christopher Eicher, like 50% of young black men in Brixton, was one of the jobless.
We were people, as young black men, and I speak of young black men in particular, we were zeros, we were persona non grata.
For the police, the problem was rising street crime, particularly muggings. Brian Fairburn was then the local police commander in Brixton.
Blacks were responsible for the greater number of muggings than whites. You would be foolish. You don't have to be a trained officer to know that you would be foolish to go and chase whites rather than blacks.
The local police in Brixton decided to take drastic measures on street crime. On the 6th of April 1981, they launched Operation Swamp.
Every 20-30 yards, 3 groups of policemen. People couldn't pass because police were there.
Over the course of 5 days, they stopped nearly 1,000 people.
If I left my shop there and walked down the street, there's a 10 to 1 chance that 5 or 6 policemen will stop me for nothing.
On the Friday afternoon, police approached a young black man called Michael Bailey, who'd been stabbed.
Police provocation, you understand?
What followed is a matter of strong dispute.
They wanted us to disperse, but we live in Brixton. This is where we live. They don't live in Brixton.
When the police backup arrived, a growing crowd began pelting them with bricks and bottles. Well, joining me round the table are 5 people who found themselves at the centre of those events 30 years ago in Brixton. Former Deputy Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police, Brian Paddock, who was then a young police sergeant attached to the force in Brixton. Peter Blexley, then a young police officer in Peckham, who was brought in as backup. Ted Knight, known as Red Ted by the press, was then the leader of Lambeth Borough Council, heading a fight against Mrs Thatcher's cuts. Writer and journalist Darcus Howe, who was then editor of Race Today, and Alex Wheatle, now an award-winning novelist with an MBE, then 18 years old and one of those involved in attacking the police. Let me start with you, Alex, a teenager then. Were you very conscious that there was a huge amount of resentment building up towards the police before
Yes,
the
I
riot?
was. I arrived in Brixton at 14 after spending some time away in a Surrey children's home, and my view of the police was a very good one. And when I came to Brixton, and I was told by the new friends that I made that they were the enemy, and slowly but surely I found out why they were the enemy.
Which was how?
When I was 16, we had a party, and we was asked to turn the music down by officers. I have to admit we didn't, but the response was I could not quite believe. There were 2 vans, I think the SPG vans, they came in, they busted down the door, busted down all the furniture, ripped up the floorboards, arrested about 30 of us. Some of my Rasta friends, their locks are torn out of their scalps.
What? Their hair was torn off?
Yep. Beat us in cells, had their feet down on our necks and our faces.
Brian Paddock, is that something that you recognise?
It isn't. I had a bit of a reputation even in those days. There was a cartoon series called The Wacky Races at the time, and I was described as Peter Perfect, the man who always did it by the rules. But the rumours from almost every young black man I spoke to on the street, you did begin to believe that these sorts of practices were going on.
Ted Knight, you led the local council. Does this picture from both sides of the community seem very familiar to you?
It certainly was, because for months before the actual incidents of that weekend, there was growing tension. And the growing tension was because the police were continuously harassing local youth in particular. And prior to that week, we'd actually been insisting, local community representatives, we had insisted that we meet with the police to discuss this. It took us something like 3 weeks to get a meeting with the local police commander. In the end, we got one. We put forward the situation that there was going to be serious damage done and an explosive situation building up. He listened and did nothing.
Peter Blexley, this was an explosion waiting to happen.
Sue, I'd like to try and put into context here what was the reality, despite what PC Perfect on my left here might actually have you believe. Young black men in Brixton and Peckham were routinely fitted up, beaten up, tortured and worse.
Tortured?
Yes. And I was turned in 3 years from a pretty sort of decent 18-year-old boy from Bexley Heath. In 3 years, my peer group and the police pressure had turned me into a violent, racist, very unpleasant thug.
What did you witness in terms of what you call torture?
We used to have skirting boards in some of the offices and the interview rooms, and the technique would be to get a prisoner to go onto their knees, and then their toes would be rested on the skirting board, and then pressure would be applied on the heels as the heels were forced downwards, which would cause excruciating pain. And that would be carried on until the prisoner would then say, OK, I'll admit to the attempted burglary or the robbery, whatever it is that the cops are alleging that person had done.
And what came to be known later as, in a different context, as institutional racism was something you came to accept?
It was compulsory. It wasn't institutionalised. It was compulsory. And where the dreads were ripped off of Rastafarians, they were proudly pinned to the notice board and displayed as some sort of trophy.
Dorcas, how did you know about this?
Yes, I was part of the fight back. I remember on the weekend, before it all exploded, there was an arrogance in the step of police officers wearing sneakers. Come here, boy. And I have got 3 children. I said, I'll only come there if your wife is there. And you have to reasonably suspect me to touch me. All the police had to do is to hear a distant drum bouncing on the laughter of a melody inside and turn the place into a room of barbarians.
On the other hand, everyone round the table must know that at that time there was an awful lot of street crime going on.
I used to go down the front line, buying my £2 drawer of weed, £5 drawer of weed, sometimes go to...
This is cannabis?
Yep, go to a gambling basement on the front line as well. I mean, smoking a spliff. Getting half a kill for smoking a spliff or dealing with a £2 drawer. It was a response to that.
And more than that, some of the stations like Brixton was not on the route to being promoted anywhere. So you got the detritus from the police force, and you got a new group of black people. The conflict was historically inevitable.
But Also,
Ted,
I think you have to understand what the situation was as far as the economic prospects of people living in Brixton. 55% of black youth were without a job and no prospect of a job. White youth also, high unemployment. And they reduced grant to local councils, and Lambeth was one of those that hit the bottom as far as cuts were concerned.
Brian Paddock, one possible trigger for what happened that particular weekend in Brixton was the experience of the police who stopped to help, in their words, a young man who'd been stabbed, a young man called Michael Bailey, and this turned very nasty.
We were constantly having problems with the ambulance service, getting ambulances, particularly to places like Brixton, quickly enough to take badly injured people to hospital. And it was practice in those days, no longer allowed, to put the victim in the back of the police van and take them to hospital in the back of the police van. Bearing in mind the background to this, you can understand how young black youths on the street would have misinterpreted what was going on as the police were taking this person, to the police station to beat them up or whatever.
I was in a van with some of my fellow cohorts and we answered the call to Brixton for urgent assistance, as they call it, and we hammered down there and turned into Rowton Road and were confronted by the very early stages of the disturbances on the Friday afternoon. There was a bit of an uncomfortable standoff. There was some piles of rubble from some building development that was going on. They were being slung at us sporadically. We had a couple of shields in the back of the van for what use they were. We were hugely outnumbered at that point, and it was a very, very uncomfortable situation. After about an hour or two, everybody withdrew to Brixton Police Station, where the senior management, in their infinite wisdom, instructed that we should then get out onto the streets in our vehicles, not get out of the vehicles, but patrol continually. So every van, every car, every people carrier that the cops could lay their hands on was stuffed filled of uniformed coppers and drove round and round and round. And as we did that, the tension built and the tension built.
That same Friday evening, I went to a blues party not far from Rowton Road, and everyone was talking about Babylon wet up a sufferer. In other words, the police had stabbed somebody. That went round Brixton like wildfire. And I didn't even go to bed that night because we was all talking about it all throughout the morning, and we decided to go to Brixton en masse in the morning.
And within about 30 minutes, about 40 young guys got together and commanded a lot of young people through this alleyway, through that alleyway, and burned the whole place down. Don't burn that, burn that.
It's absolute chaos. There's no other way you can describe it. It's chaos, look.
Things took a turn for the worse around 6 o'clock when petrol bombs were thrown at the police.
The police are being pelted with petrol bombs, bricks and bottles. In return, they drum their truncheons on their riot shields. I've seen a score of policemen dragged back out of the smoke, blood pouring down their faces, their legs trailing along the streets which are carpeted with shattered glass.
The streets were soon invaded by cameras, not all of them welcome.
Don't film me. Don't film me. Don't bother with all that. Okay. Right?
There's overturned cars in the streets. There's Molotov cocktails.
Linda Bellos, later to become leader of Lambeth Council, urged the police to withdraw. For Police Commander Brian Fairbairn, that wasn't an option.
I knew, from what I've been told, from the observations I've made myself, that they would have seen this as a victory over the police and they would have never withdrawn.
I've got John Clare from BBC News with me. He'd like to talk with you.
We want all...
One masked rioter gave a list of demands to a BBC reporter.
We want all them policemen to move back and go about them business. Go somewhere else. You understand?
You look exhausted. Tell me how you feel.
Very, very tired.
And a clearly shocked policeman offered his thoughts to the BBC's John Clare.
How do you feel about what you've had to do today?
It's part of a job. It's as simple as that.
Were you hurt?
I think everyone's been hurt.
Why do you think it's happened?
Heaven alone knows.
Alex Wheatle, we heard a lot of very angry voices from the black community making demands. Do you remember that?
I remember that we felt we wanted to keep hold of Rowton Road and Mall Road. We didn't want the police to break our lines. That was a real battle. And I remember low walls fronting houses. We tore those down for ammunition. we wanted that confrontation, definitely.
And the Molotov cocktails, were you surprised to see them? That's a petrol in a bottle and you'd set fire to it.
Of course I was surprised. I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know what it was when they first appeared. And when they started to be launched into the police ranks and we saw fire, it's exhilarating, it's empowering to actually see the police retreat.
Yeah, on the Friday night when we were doing this red rag to a ball tomfoolery, we'd seen milk crates being carried down into the basement of blues, clubs and spielers and all that sort of stuff on the Friday night. So you didn't have to be Einstein to work out what was coming.
You mean people were planning what would they do on the Saturday?
Yeah, we could quite clearly see, young black youths with a milk crate full of empty milk bottles.
Ted?
I think it's wrong to believe that this was just the police reacting. I think the police very consciously were participating in an organised situation.
You mean they were ready for confrontation?
They were ready for it. You cannot mobilise 2,500 police within a few hours to be there. What was quite clear is they were drawing people in, drawing reserves of police from the sticks, as it were, outside of London, bringing them into London, keeping them in coaches for long hours at a time, and they were very angry. And then they released them onto the streets.
Brian Paddock, you were a young police sergeant then, and you were shaking your head listening to Ted.
Well, that wasn't my experience. I mean, I was at home pressing my uniform, and I saw colleagues that I knew on the newsreels with blood streaming down their faces. So I phoned up the control room at Brixton and said, would you like me to come in? And I was told in no uncertain terms that I should do. So I got into my own MG sports car, drove into Brixton and got caught in a traffic jam in Acre Lane. So I put the uniform on before I left home. So I'm sat in this traffic jam in Acre Lane in full uniform in my private MG sports car, when a group of youths put the window in of an electrical shop right next to me where I'm stuck in traffic. And I did what any sensible person did, which was immediately remove my police uniform jacket and sort of slouch down in the car and hope they never noticed me.
What, you didn't get out and arrest them?
Now the police have a plan to mobilise large numbers of officers. In those days, they had this reserve of people who lived in police accommodation that they could call upon. These were ordinary police constables being either pulled in from other parts of London or from their days off, being given plastic shields out of the back of a green lorry parked by the side of Brixton Police Station, and being put under the command of hopefully local officers who knew the layout.
And every brick and every stone that hit our van reverberated like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah,
and each time that a window went in, or worse still, the windscreen, the noise and the atmosphere inside the van was just
terrifying.
It was terrifying, but in the same measure, it kind of strengthened your resolve, and it made you feel that you were suddenly really here in a battle. And it was like, right, we got to, it was almost survival at some point.
And yet, Darkus, it seems that the black community was surprisingly well organised from an early stage. How did that happen?
Well, when you lived in Brixton at the time, there is no black boy without a crew. They were in groups of 10, 15. I used to play cricket with them. So you had these knots of black boys. They would even go to church together. But the thing about the police was, where did they get 7,445 policemen over that period?
It's a great conspiracy theory, but trust me, the police weren't that clever. Right, they really weren't. Now, you got to understand the mentality of the basic cop on the street in those days. If they've got the opportunity for a tear-up, to jump on a bus and go with a load of their mates, pile into Brixton and have a racist ruck, no wonder they flocked there, because that was the mindset. So when they rang them up and said, there's a bus outside the section house, jump on it and come and have a tear-up, they flocked to Brixton.
When you say they, you were one of them.
Indeed, but I'd been there on the Friday afternoon in a van, and I snatched a few hours on the Friday night and was back there on Saturday for yet more nonsense.
There's an awful lot of testosterone flying around, isn't there, between the black guys and the white police officers? Darkus.
I had gone home to the house, and I thought, what the hell is this? I saw a lot of people, policemen, about a serial and a half, running up the Railton Road. So I'm looking that way to see who they're chasing. Behind them is a serial or two of young blacks.
Amongst them, Alex, did you chuck a Molotov cocktail at all?
Yes, I did. I saw one on the street and I threw it. Some of us quick runners, would lure the police into a trap. And we would make them chase us up into a street where a whole posse were waiting nearby with Molotov cocktails and such. And they would get a barrage.
This is a sort of kettling in reverse.
Yeah, definitely.
You would sort of move forward, the youths would retreat a bit, then they would start attacking you again. And one of the officers ran towards the youths, the sort of trap that was going on. I had to scream at this guy to get him back into the safety in numbers that we had behind the shields.
Did you fear for his life?
I did fear for his life. And, you know, some years later, in another riot in another part of London, one of our colleagues lost his life in very similar circumstances. So it was, you know, by luck, really, that nobody did die.
Peter?
Alex's recollections were spot on. We were outmanoeuvred, outflanked, and the rioters' tactics were far more of the street. And they were just better and more clever than us. And the stats bear that out. You know, 300 cops got injured and about 60 members of the public. We got hammered.
Flames and thick black smoke from blazing houses, pubs and shops have cast a heavy orange pall over the whole area.
It was clear that along with the general destruction, there was also a great deal of looting. Bob Simpson reported from the scene.
I'm now standing just outside Brixton Station. The plate glass window of a furniture shop being smashed.
The police stood watching under orders not to intervene.
There are a few people left in the streets which are absolutely covered in smashed showcases, paper, water, broken glass.
And then there was a change of tactics. The police, now 1,000 strong and banging their shields, began to make headway.
They're advancing up 2 streets now at the same time. On my right, there's about 40 or 50 police crouched behind their riot shields.
With order apparently restored, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir David McNee, arrived to see things for himself.
It's not an easy exercise to control 700 or 800 marauding young blacks and whites who support them. And I think that my police officers did a first-rate job.
There's an awful lot of looting.
Well, of course there's an awful lot of looting, but don't look at the police, look at the looters. You need an awful lot of policemen to look after 800 marauding young blacks.
Peter Blexley, as things were just beginning to die down, although there was a heck of a mess left, we heard the police commissioner, the Met Police Commissioner, Sir David McNee, saying that he thought the guys had done a first-rate job, the police officers.
I suppose amuse isn't the right word, but when David McNee said, you know, look at the people who are the reason for this, I wonder if the reporter was tempted to give him a mirror. Because really, at the end of the day, the undeniable fact was that Operation Swamp and all the things that we've spoken about was the blue touch paper.
Unfortunately, Sir David McNee had come down from a Scottish force and was never particularly popular with rank and file officers. And, you know, I think the feeling at the end of Saturday night was that we'd lost it, that we had lost control of the streets, that we had been beaten. And unfortunately, that led to a mindset in some officers that they needed to get their own back.
He's very right. That is why they referred to the police as pigs at the time. And the slogan was, the pigs, the pigs. You've got to get rid of the pigs.
Alex Wheatle, you could say that it was the amateur guerrilla warfare experts that won the battle.
Even a Sunday night, the police were attacked on the fringes because they had most of the control of Brixton Town Centre. I remember they had formed a beachhead in St Matthew's Church and all along the front line. But I remember on a Sunday night, it was very striking for me. Coaches had lined up and all these policemen were sipping, I don't know if you remember, Peter, Brian, from polystyrene cups, soups and whatever. And I remember Tumper's shop was open.
Yeah.
Tumper's shop. And he made a roaring trade. And I was thinking to myself, maybe the police should go into Tumper's shop and ask for a dumpling or something. You could get flying fish there, dumplings, Jamaican soup. It's only at that time I saw the humanity of the police, because they were slouched down in their, I think, green vans, was it? Yeah. And they looked broken.
Yes, but already the police were plotting their revenge.
Revenge, absolutely.
Yeah. A squad was formed, which is normal police practice, or was in those days. So if a telly was found dropped and broken on the street, if it was possible, keep that, get it fingerprinted, and thereafter, slowly, we'll come after the rioters. And one officer took great joy because he got a 6'3" young black man convicted of stealing a size 5 lady's shoe.
Darcus, Alex has been quite upfront about the part he played in the rioting. Were you there standing on the side, or did you participate in any way?
I didn't participate. By that time I had a reputation as a thinker and not a thug. And I was a full man. I had children. They didn't need me. But they needed me to say afterwards that the police were defeated. The slogan was, "Black people united and the police were defeated." You know, when you beat up somebody, you begin to feel a sense of guilt. I had a touch of that because they ran away. And we didn't mention one important thing about that. Mrs. Thatcher was getting into her Argentinian mood, Falklands mood.
This was pre-82.
Yeah. She was getting into that mood. And Willie Whitelaw had to tell her how far Brixton was from the river that crossed the Thames to Parliament. He says, "Listen, Margaret, that's just round the corner."
While Darcus was thinking, a lot of us were simply exhausted. Exhausted. My arms were this... I tried to make it home, and I remember I was chasing to this little estate, Tulsa Estate, opposite Tulsa School, and because I was so tired, I managed to get into the estate. I jumped into a garbage bin because I was just so exhausted. And there was talk of that when I got back to the hostel, a few of my mates were there was talk about maybe going up to Whitehall. But we were just simply exhausted.
Were you shocked at the level of violence at the height of the rioting? Ted Knight.
I thought the reaction of the community to the police was acceptable, in the sense that the police, I think, were provoking.
Cocktails?
Well, I think the police were provoking them, and the police were intent on driving them into submission.
I wouldn't say that the violence that was expressed by local people that night was justifiable, but I would say it was understandable. People in Brixton at that time did not believe that they had anywhere else to go. They had nothing else to lose.
There was this morning a strange silence as residents tried to comprehend what had happened. Only last night the Windsor Castle had been serving drinks. Now it's completely devastated, as if it had been blown up by a bomb.
What do you think you have learned from a 10-minute...
The Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, arrived to survey the scene.
A serious breakdown of law and order occurred. I've also seen enough to convince me that the police have, in their very difficult task, and I want to say this again and again, deserve the support of every law-abiding citizen in this country, because we ask the police to carry out these duties on our behalf.
The crowd greeted him with ironic Nazi chanting. Allegations of excessive police violence started to emerge.
They start to use the button and us.
Hit you with it?
Hit me with the button and lick my son in his head.
The BBC's John Clare gave his eyewitness view.
I also saw 3 policemen in plain clothes carrying unauthorised weapons. One was a long, heavy stick, one was a brand new pickaxe handle, and the third was an 18-inch long, flexible, solid rubber kosh.
We want to be able to walk the streets. We want jobs. We want better opportunities. We are frustrated and we are fed up.
Today, Linda Bellis believes that the riots in Brixton were the action of a community crying out for help.
It was a reaction to suppression, a reaction to marginalisation, a reaction to violence and discrimination.
Alex Wheatle, there was a huge amount of violence, and you've said that you were part of it at one point. 300 police officers ended up in hospital. What do you feel about that now? Do you feel responsible in any way? Do you feel any kind of regret about that?
Well, obviously regret. I mean, who wants to injure somebody or really hurt somebody, you know? And I remember days after the riots, there was regret, because I remember friends of mine couldn't even cash their gyros they got from the unemployment toll office because the post office had closed down or had boarded windows and everyone was cleaning up and And I myself, I was arrested 2-3 weeks after for causing an affray, and we had some stolen gear in there as well, clothes and shoes. And so I remember going to prison and thinking, was it worth it? Because there was no immediate changes. I was still hearing stories of my peers getting beaten up, and I was thinking, we've done this, and yet it's still happening.
The streets must have looked a bit like a war zone, Darkus, on the Sunday.
And, it was almost, people were making the pilgrimage from, say, Hackney and to Brixton. They're coming from everywhere. I remember Dan Abbott and Lord Pitt, who had never been that far into Brixton before, walking down, just surveying a wondrous cross. It was almost a tourism.
Ted Knight, amongst the many thoughts crowding into your head on Sunday night, must have been the one, who's going to pay this?
There was that bill to be paid for. There was also the fact that for months and several years previously, there had been cutbacks. We asked for an immediate meeting with the government, and we asked for a meeting with Heseltine, who was the government minister. And when I sat in front of Heseltine, and I said to him, not only do we need money for the clean-up that's going to take place, we also need money to restore and build new facilities for youth in the area. He said, Ted, if I give you an extra £1, he said, they'll bring in the boys in white coats to take me away. He said, there's no way that we're going to give you more money.
Brian Paddick and Peter Blexley, were your thoughts afterwards, can we ever repair relations between the black community and the overwhelmingly white police force?
I had been so traumatised by the level of hatred that had been shown towards me, not me the individual, because the people didn't know me, but the cloth that I wore, the uniform that I wore. That was such a symbol of hatred that all my thoughts turned to a career move to get out of that uniform. And it was that weekend that made my mind up to ditch that uniform and become a detective. I suppose I did have some sort of naive Dixon of Green ideology when I first joined the cops, which was pretty soon thrashed out of me, but having said that, that weekend I was never ever going to be a symbol of such hatred again.
I, unfortunately, ended up making a career of siding with the community rather than the police and getting myself into all sorts of trouble because of it. But I believe that the only way that you could police an area, particularly an area like Brixton, was with the support and cooperation of the local people. And the problem that we had was that we were like an occupying army.
Was leadership blamed, Brian Paddick?
I think the leadership were blamed for the injuries that the rank and file officers suffered on the ground. I don't think there was any feeling that it was the actions of senior officers that led to the uprising in the first place.
Brian, trust me, those of us that were there on the Friday night, still to this day, quite squarely lay the blame for the events of Saturday and Sunday at the doors of those foolish senior officers who made us patrol and patrol and patrol on the Friday night, like the proverbial red rag. The hand gestures, the insults. You could feel the tension rising.
Alex Wheatle?
For me, the seminal moment was 2 or 3 days after the main rioting. It was Newsnight, and there was Paul Boateng arguing our case. And that's never happened before.
A black politician.
Yeah. It's never happened, as far as I know. I wasn't an avid viewer of Newsnight, but there was somebody representing our thoughts, our views, and how we saw life. But for once, we've been talked about and our thoughts are being considered.
The events of this weekend called for the most thorough examination. I have therefore decided to appoint an inquiry.
Next day in Parliament, the Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, announced the setting up of an inquiry into the Brixton riot, to be headed by the distinguished lawyer Lord Scarman.
Lord Scarman, what sort of information are you asking people to come forward with?
Two sorts of information. One, about the facts of the riots, very important. The other, to come forward with their views as to the underlying social conditions giving rise to the sort of tensions which broke out into these disturbances.
The media, though, was now beginning to focus on the simmering tensions of inner cities elsewhere.
In Nationwide tonight, the violent cities of Britain, after another weekend of rioting in London and Liverpool,
we'll be looking at the possible causes.
By the time Lord Scarman's report was published in November 1981, similar disturbances had taken place across the country.
On Friday, Southall Broadway in West London became the latest battlefield in London's history of racial
There were
tension.
violent clashes between coloured youths and the police in Liverpool last night.
After the trouble spread to Toxteth in Liverpool in July, the government announced the creation of an inner-city task force with a £90 million budget to spend nationwide. Michael Heseltine, the Environment Secretary, was responsible for how much money was allocated.
And I had a task force of civil servants and secondees from the private sector. And what they did, frankly, they beavered away very effectively, showing that the problems they had, you could actually do something about them. You could improve housing conditions. You could create jobs for the unemployed. You could attract new industrial investment, providing someone would show a lead.
Let's talk first of all about what Lord Scarman found in his inquiry. He said that he thought that far from being organised in advance, that the riot was a spontaneous outburst of resentment, and he also found evidence of discrimination in stop-and-search laws. He recommended new codes of police behaviour, and an independent police complaints authority was set up. Did he get it right, Ted Knight?
I think he certainly attempted to find out the social causes of what the problems were. He was wanted to go walk everywhere within the area of the conflict, and I walked with him, as did representatives of black youth as well. Youngsters were there, young people were there. It was a feeling that here was a representative of the establishment, which we were very hesitant about at first.
No, I didn't think he tackled the issue at all. There's still some... If he had tackled the issue of stop and search would not be still continuing. I think he did not know the people of Brixton long enough. I don't think he knew policing long enough. Scarman didn't grasp the nettle. We here talked much more about what actually happened than Scarman ever knew.
Alex Wheatle?
To be honest, because he was an establishment figure, we all felt, my peer group, that it was going to be a complete whitewash. We never expected anything to be coming out on our side, as it were. But when he did finally come up with a report and he cited racism, he cited bad housing, he cited unemployment, we all felt, wow. Even though it wasn't all what we wanted, we were surprised by that element of that report.
And it was obvious, Brian Paddock, from Lord Scarman's report that police behaviour had to change.
Absolutely, and particularly that the police needed to listen to what local people had to say, and also that keeping the peace was more important than enforcing the law in certain circumstances.
And looking back on those events, it seems to me, sitting next to you, Peter, that you find it still really quite traumatic just to hear the descriptions and to think about what happened.
I don't find it traumatic. I'm a keen student of modern history, and to have been a part of it, it's not something I'm proud of, but I was there, and I'm this passionate about everything. So, and I keep very close contact with current policing. There is still much to be done.
You mean, are you talking about what Lord Macpherson called later institutional racism?
Indeed, that does. I mean, shamefully, I went to a retirement function not that long ago, and I heard dinosaur dialogue which belonged to a bygone time and yet sadly is still in existence. So there is still much work to be done.
Brian Paddock?
I have to agree with what Darker said. The one thing that I think even Macpherson shied away from was dealing with issues around racism and stop and search. You're still 7-8 times more likely to be stopped and searched in this country if you are black than if you are white. It is a real issue that really needs to be tackled, and the police are not going to tackle it unless there is a political will behind that to force them into action. Even we are now, 30 years after the event, and still we have not dealt with this issue of stop and search.
And Ted Knight, a few years after these events, let's move forward to 1985, you found yourself barred from office for 5 years because of your determination to pursue an anti-cuts agenda.
Because we refused to make the cuts that were necessary were demanded by the government. We argued that the inner cities required investment by central government. They required facilities for people to lead lives that were productive. They had to provide jobs, and this couldn't be done under the cuts that were being made by the Thatcher government. And we resisted those cuts, and we refused to make them, and in the end they removed us from office.
Dorcas Howe?
So, all I want to say is I went to my daughter's 40th birthday party on Friday, and my grandson was there, my first grandchild. And I asked him, do the police stop you and search you? He said, Dad, I'm tired counting. And I thought, this is wrong. He said, Dad, enjoy yourself. Dad, talk to you another time. He had stopped counting.
Alex Wheatle, you're the youngest person round the table.
Am I?
Probably. If you were taking a visitor who'd never been to Britain, to Brixton today, what sort of Brixton would you show them?
I showed them the sushi bar on Rowton Road. I'll show them the art gallery that's now on Rowton Road.
You kind of posh fella now.
I'd show him... I've cultured. I'd show him the potential building for the Black Cultural Archives that we're going to have just received funding from the National Lottery. I showed him the streets where I used to live. I showed him where we fought the police. But also, I'll tell this person that I hated the police as much as anybody. But to change an institution like that, do we just let them get on with it? Or do we try to effect change? And that's part of my work, that's what I'm trying. I'm trying to effect some change.
Alex Wheatle, Dorcas Howe, Brian